so I don't forget here. Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome back to this week's episode. I'm here in Zoomland with Arjun Murti, energy, macro, and equities analyst, advisor, and director. Arjun is also the publisher of Super Spike, which focuses on the messy energy transition era that has arrived. Arjun, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, Justin. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. No, the pleasure is all mine. And where are you joining from today? Are you based in New York? Is that right?
I am based in the greater New York area, so born, raised, and moved back. So this is where I do everything.
Okay. So I don't know if you're a sports fan, but Yankees or Mets?
Yeah, Yankees for sure. So Yankees, Knicks, Rangers, but I actually grew up a Dallas Cowboys fan. I figured they were America's team growing up, so it doesn't matter where you live, including in the New York area. So
Actually, it's funny. So I grew up, I was born in Calgary, raised in British Columbia, and I grew up, loving football, and I had a Emmitt Smith poster on my wall. I don't know who got it for me, where it came from, but ever since that point, I loved Emmitt Smith. I loved the Cowboys. And so deep down, I've always been a Cowboys fan. And, being from Canada, it's like you're either a Buffalo Bills fan if you're from the East, or if you're from the West, you're a Seattle Seahawks fan. And then everything else in between for the most part. But
well,
yeah,
I used to be a fan of the Edmonton Oilers, actually, when Warren Moon played for them, if I remember correctly, before he played for one of the CFL teams. I want to say it was Edmonton, but that's actually the name of the hockey team. So I might be off on maybe it's the Edmonton Eskimos. So
the Eskimos, the Eskimos is a CFL team out of Edmonton. Right. Yeah. Yeah, Warren Moon. That's a name that's stuck around in Canada for a long time. That's good. And you said a Giants fan or Jets?
Dallas Cowboys.
So neither one at all.
Neither one. No, I mean,
okay,
get a lot of grief from my friends, but definitely America's team is the team. So,
well, then I have to ask. I mean, how about them Cowboys? Are we looking good this year or what?
A little nervous. The offensive line's taken some hits, and I think last year should have been their year, but we just can't quite find the right coach to get what is at times a talented team over the top. So I'm not super optimistic, but we'll see. So,
well, they'll probably be better than the Texans this year. And I'm out of Houston. So, it's not hard to beat the Texans, but I'll go Dallas Cowboys all day long. Man, so, we're ripping through the summer here. It flew by, at least it did for me and my family. How's everything up in New York, kind of kicking things into fall? I mean, just in general, I would imagine, I haven't been there for a few years, but I mean, everything's wide open. Everyone's out and about. I mean, is it pretty much good to go now?
Yeah, I think we're finally out of lockdown mode here in the greater New York area. Thank goodness. And, I'd say I was actually in the city yesterday, and it was a rainy day, but the city was for sure alive and going and all those kind of good things. So yeah, I love summer, but nice to have fall here, and feels like things are kicking back into gear.
Yeah, no, my wife and I actually, we went in 2018, and, being in Houston since I don't know, the last 7-8 years, I miss the winters and the Christmas with, the lights and the Christmas spirit. Growing up in Canada, it's, we wake up and there's snow on the ground. And so my wife and I were like, well, let's go to New York. And so we went right after Thanksgiving. So kind of in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And man, what a magical place. And we stayed in Times Square, which typical tourist, right? But it was the coolest experience. And I absolutely love New York. And when we're finally in a position financially, I would love to have a place to like go for the weekend in New York somewheres. But it is such a cool city, man. I don't blame you for still living there.
It's funny you say that, because as my kids are now, I think I'm a little older than you. My kids are now getting into the college years, and as sort of the light is at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, in terms of them being with us full time, it's actually the middle of the country that I think we aspire to have a second place or an occasional place to go to, whether it's Colorado or Texas or something like that.
Yeah,
I think there is appeal to seeing some different things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's cool. And so for the listeners, like many of my guests and contacts, I sent Arjun a message on LinkedIn after I listened to him provide his take on the role of Canadian energy. And this was on a Twitter space. Josh Young is a gentleman who I've followed and actually through work, he's got a mutual friend. And so I started following him, months and months ago. And then through time, I've just sort of picked up on different people. And then he started the Twitter spaces. And then now there's just a slew of folks that are doing it, which is amazing. And I was actually I was in the airport and I opened my Twitter, of course, trying to, get the latest and greatest for that moment. And I saw this Twitter space and, Canadian energy. I need to, because I still have a bunch of friends and stuff like that still back in the patch up north. And man, you just gave such an interesting perspective, which I do want to touch on. But that's why I reached out, and I was like, it's a shot in the dark whether this gentleman will respond or not, because I figured you were busy. And you did respond. And so I was like, yeah, this is going to be great. But I encourage everyone, and I'll put the link in the show notes because, I do have some listeners from back home in Calgary. And again, you may or may not know Arjun, but you put out some fantastic content. And if anyone's interested on sort of the role in Canadian energy and sort of full cycle project type stuff, economics, it was fantastic. And so I'll put the link of your Substack and that specific Twitter space up there. Because again, I just thought it was just very refreshing and just very practical without it. And so again, I applaud you for putting that stuff out there. How long have you been kind of creating content and putting your message out there? Because it's kind of rare for someone like yourself with that type of experience, and especially some of the roles that you carry right now.
Yeah, and thank you. It's funny. So you reached out via LinkedIn, and I thought, well, let me just see what this guy's about. And I saw that you had a podcast, and I listened to some of the episodes, and I just appreciated your very sort of positive, uplifting tone and approach and view of the world, and it matches my own at least goals. I'm not sure I'm always as positive as I aspire to be, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misinformation about traditional energy, new energy, the energy transition, and all these things. And I kind of despise the extreme partisanship and vitriol that you often find, not just in social media, but everywhere. And so one of my goals of Super Spike was to bring hopefully a healthier conversation. And I felt like you were a brother in arms, so to speak, in doing that. So
Yeah,
I actually started Super Spike just this past November. And so for the first 22 years of my career, which dates back to the early 1990s, I was essentially a Wall Street energy analyst, mostly at Goldman Sachs. I was also at JP Morgan and a boutique investment bank in Denver, Petrie Parkman originally, but covering the broad energy sector, US, Canadian oils, oversaw our global oils team and so forth. And for a variety of reasons, retired from Goldman in 2014. It's about 8 years ago now. And since then, I've been in these various behind the scenes kind of roles on the board of ConocoPhillips, advisor to a private equity firm, an advisory board member at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. And they've all been a lot of fun, kind of synergistic with each other, consistent with my prior background, knowing energy, but all behind the scenes. And I don't know, something about, I think, the deep trough we saw in COVID, the rise of sort of what I'm going to call a climate only ideology. I'm a firm believer there is a goal to decarbonize, there is a goal to clean up our environment, but it has to start with let's provide energy for all. I thought this whole conversation about energy transition is really off base. It's based on a bunch of misunderstanding and mistruths, some of it related to the Canadian sector, as you alluded to before. And it motivated me to first get on Twitter. And Twitter's, I actually have made friends with Twitter, but it's hard to do long form on Twitter and to really add nuance. And hence I created my own Substack last November. And I've really enjoyed sort of the response and being out there. So I'd say I'm a content creator, which I find kind of amusing as someone in their 50s, but I'm a content creator for the last 10 months now. So
yeah, well, no, it's amazing. And then I think for folks, everyone can create content. And as long as the intent comes, and again, not to be woo-woo, but as long as it comes from the heart, and the intent is to provide value, which it's clear that you're not doing it for any monetary reasons, at least not from what it appears, but to truly educate and inform, hopefully, the masses, to help them hopefully make better decisions on whether it's whether it's voting, or whether they buy this vehicle, or whether they understand the framework in which we work in. I just think that, again, in being that I'm, purebred oil and gas from the time I graduated high school till now, I still appreciate the fact that there are some exciting technologies out there, but there's certain realities that I think need to be considered that oftentimes don't. And so folks like yourself that are saying, hey, here are things that we really need to consider, and here's might be some things that are somewhat misleading. I think there needs to be more of it, but not in a way that everyone else is dumb. Look at the facts, because that's never going to win anyone over. And I've had a lot of folks that I've encountered, say, hey, let's all band together and beat our chests and preach to the choir. And it's like, that's all fine. Like, I get that. right? But in order to actually make change and make some positive progression, we need to talk to folks who have opposing views and have constructive conversations and educate them in a kind way. You know what I mean? And again, which is what I see coming from yourself. I'm curious though. So if you go on your Substack, you have an interesting shot. It's sort of a selfie of you outside of a restaurant with big letters saying Ritas and burgers. And I was so curious. I feel like is a very important picture for you. And so what is the significance of this particular spot? Or were you showing off the red Nissan car in the back? I don't know.
Well, Justin, I'm going to give you one guess, since your listeners probably don't need 10 minutes of us guessing about this, about where that picture was taken. And so the hint will be, it's definitely not New York. I
It
knew
doesn't
you had a
look like it.
Canadian energy background, but I did not know you spent time in Texas. So it's probably enough of a hint right there.
I mean, I'm just gonna go off and say Midland.
It's close. It's from the Eagleford Shale. So we had done
Okay.
a field trip to visit some operations in and around the Eagleford. My wife's name happens to be Rita, and I loved
Ah,
that we got to just go to. I'm going to sorry call it a regular bar. So
yeah.
sometimes when you get flown around to these places, they try and find this fancy restaurant or so on and so forth. It was great to be with. I'm just going to call actual oil and gas workers who were in the
Yes.
Eagleford. And while they did try and stick us in a private dining room, we all went out and tried to do our own share of beers and maybe a shot or two at the bar with the folks who were actually working in the field. And I tell you, I grew up on the East Coast of the U.S. I do
Yeah.
not have an oil and gas background. I've never worked in the industry, but the admiration I have for all the men and women that allow us to keep our lights on and drive our cars. And sorry to sound hokey about it, but it is really amazing work they do. And I think, again, the vitriol of the public debate over climate versus energy security and these kind of things, people forget it's actual, I'm going to say, regular people that actually do the hard work that allow us to enjoy the lifestyles that we enjoy.
Yeah, and again, like coming from a gentleman like yourself, who like you had mentioned, it's like you hadn't worked there, and so you certainly can't put yourself in their shoes from experience. But you're absolutely right. And someone like myself, who's been on rigs, was a mud engineer, it's just the countless amount of sacrifice. I mean, everyone makes sacrifice, and it's all relative, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, some guys in the field like being away from their families and wives for a little bit, but either way, it's being away from family and friends during holidays for 30, 40 years of a career, it can be draining. And so, until we get to a time where we can fully, frack and drill, with full automation, the reality is it's going to take folks to go out there. And that's actually one of the challenges that we're seeing, again, and I speak from a drilling operations and sort of more upstream perspective, but I think it applies across the board, to where there's a lot of, when I started, I graduated with, C's and B's, nothing outstanding. I really didn't want to go to school. And the only way that I could make a living and make the money that I wanted to was to go work in the patch, right? It's like I can go make 80 or $90,000 a year as an 18-year-old. And if I was to try and get a job, at the city, I may make 20 or 30. But nowadays, like that is not the case. And so I guess, Arjun, my question to you is like, as an industry, or what's your perspective on, because there's a lot of push. Oh, we need to increase production. And, there's a lot of noise out there, but ultimately the reality is like, we can't just open the taps, which everyone knows. Some may not, some more than others, but the reality is like, there's just not as many people that want to get either back into the industry that have left, or when you're an 18-year-old, you can go work McDonald's and then have a side hustle on your phone and still make 70 or $80,000 a year. Whereas your rig hand buddy is gone half of the year and making roughly the same, and he's putting his life at risk. His family's not around. And so like, what's your thoughts around all that? And then how do we move forward to be able to actually, you know, man our rigs and our field folks? Because without the folks in the field, we really can't do anything.
There's no question the criticality, the oil and gas does not bubble out of the ground on its own. As you know, you can automate some of this stuff, but you still need actual people there to drill wells, to get out of the ground, and so forth. Listen, the industry, certainly throughout my 30-year career, and you can go back, there's been some great books written by Dan Jurgen and Bob McNally and a bunch of others that go through the real history of this business. It's
Yeah.
been a boom bust business since it started in the 1800s. And that boom bust has always created these cycles of not just price volatility and earnings volatility for stock prices or what have you, but employment volatility as well. And I don't know that I have a solution to it other than to acknowledge it exists. we're coming at the end of what I'm going to call a 15-year downturn, some, decade, 2010s. I date it back sometimes to the 2007, 2008 peak. Whatever your starting point is, a long period of sort of structural underperformance for this sector. So it's going to take some time to reattract workers back to the business. I'd say I'm surprised to hear that a rig worker might not make that much more or even the same as someone, as you described it, who's working at McDonald's with maybe some side hustle, content creation, or Uber driving or what have you. I would hope and I would think the work that this sector does is worthy of better compensation than perhaps alternate career paths. And I think that is what it's going to take to reattract workers back to this business. I don't know, to be honest, that we'll ever get away from the boom bust cycles and from companies both wanting to hire a whole bunch of people for some time and then ultimately, unfortunately, laying them off. But to attract workers back, which we're clearly going to need, because we're going to need American energy. We're going to need Canadian energy. We definitely don't need to want to rely on Russia, Middle East. And I'm an American, so I apologize to folks that have a different perspective, but there's certainly other countries that I think we'd want to de-emphasize. And it's going to take American and Canadian workers to come back to the sector. Companies are going to have to attract them. And I hope this sector will prove attractive to people of all ages, but especially folks, Justin, who look closer in age to you or maybe even younger, to see this as a really good industry where you don't need some Greek philosophy degree from Harvard to actually earn what is probably going to be a more interesting, more rewarding, more worthwhile endeavor than some of the alternatives that are out there.
Yeah, no, and I think, Arjun, I think where folks like yourself play a critical role in this is all the attention right now for the younger generation that are ultimately going to be the next leaders. Is educating them, because I think a lot, and I know this because I've spoken to interns within our organization. It's like, what attracted you to the business? And it was either, they understood. Most of the ones graduating from PE right now weren't doing it for the money, but they understood the value and the importance of cheap, reliable, and affordable and abundant energy. And so they sort of had the mindset as like, they understood the fundamentals of supply and demand. It's like the energy is going to need, or the world is going to need more energy. Therefore, folks like myself, I see the opportunity. But the challenge is there's not a lot of content being created to attract the younger generation. And so for folks like yourself who are creating the content for say people like that, and there's a lot of folks on Twitter that look for credible information. Obviously, there's a ton of garbage out there, but for folks like yourself that are creating this content, the younger generation can say, hey, this individual seems very knowledgeable in the space, and wow, he's fairly bullish, and it doesn't look like oil and gas is going to be gone in 5 years. Maybe there is a career opportunity here. So I think that's where, I think that helps our industry as well, is providing information to understand how much runway we truly have. And so to kind of pivot, I'm curious.
Justin, let me just add on one point to what you just said, which is, I hear as someone who's either somewhat senior at a variety of these types of firms and organizations, that younger folks who are graduating college today, they want a purpose to their life, maybe more so than my generation 30 years ago wanted, where it might have been, okay, this job, finance industry is going to pay a lot, and I happen to like finance, so that fortunately goes together. And so the thing I'd say is, I can't think of a more noble cause than to work in the oil and gas industry. 83, 84, depending on how you're counting it, % of our primary energy supply comes from some combination of oil, natural gas, and coal. And while there are efforts to grow other, types of energy, which are needed and hopefully will happen, the idea that this business is going away anytime soon is simply ludicrous. Not only is it ludicrous, it is going to be bad for humanity if for some reason we did try to move away from especially oil and natural gas, and possibly coal as well, too quickly. When you think about the growth in human population, it has flourished. We've had a significant increase in population since the Industrial Revolution and the fossil fuel age started in the 1800s. And with it, people live longer, they have better health outcomes. If you looked at a map of where air quality is good and where it's bad, you will find a direct correlation to how much fossil fuels are used, with the good air quality, coincidentally or otherwise, coming in the richer countries, which are more fossil fuel based. And so that is not to say there aren't things to be done on the environmental front. But if you care about lifting people out of poverty, the 1 to 3 billion people that are still very energy poor and do not enjoy the kind of lifestyles we had, then I can't imagine a more noble cause than actually being an oil and gas worker, not necessarily an executive.
Sure.
You need executives to run these companies. You need board members to oversee the executives, but to actually be an oil and gas worker, I will still say it will always, I think, be a boom bust cycle. So while I think we are at the start of what could be a decade plus of a more bullish, a more optimistic environment, it will have its ups and downs. I'd say through those ups and downs, though, I'm not sure there is a more noble industry than one that provides the basis for human life, which is energy availability. And so thank goodness, thank God for American and Canadian oil and gas workers and workers around the world for that matter.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, it speaks volumes, and hopefully that message can be spread in a way that at least can help people, give them enough information to perhaps change their perspective just a little bit. And so I'm curious. I mean, clearly, you lean, towards being very pro oil and gas. Have you had any core beliefs that you've changed your mind over the last few years regarding energy? I mean, there's been a lot of change, a lot of initiative. Has any of that made you kind of sit back and say, I'm kind of going to recalibrate here. However, I'm going to stick to my thesis, comma, there may be something there that I didn't consider. Does anything kind of come to mind, or something that you can elaborate on?
Justin, I'm gonna tweak some of what you just said. It's certainly true that I'm very supportive of the oil and gas industry, but I would not call myself actually, and you didn't exactly, an oil and gas advocate. What I'm an advocate for is abundant energy for all, first and foremost. Then it should be affordable, and then it should
Right.
be reliable and from secure places. And then lastly, ideally with as small of a climate and environmental footprint as possible. But you have to provide energy for all. And you definitely cannot and should not be taking away energy from some and keeping it from others who never had it in the first place. That is completely unacceptable. And in the context of this type of framework, we are going to need oil and gas, again, ideally with as small of an environmental and climate footprint as possible. We're going to absolutely need it. So in that respects, I'm very constructive on the sector in terms of fulfilling these very important human needs. I'd say I think things that I've changed my mind on, probably the number one thing has been the need to be out there more visibly and vocally. So even in my career at Goldman Sachs on Wall Street, it was actually, even though the media sometimes picked up on various calls me or my colleagues would make about this oil price forecast or that, it was actually a pretty private type job where you'd speak to the leading pension and hedge funds or the leading CEOs, and sometimes not even the smaller cap companies. It really was just you're just going to talk to the high end of the high end. And then since I retired from Goldman in these board and advisory roles, it's been that times 5, where it's an even smaller group of really some of the most senior executives, government officials around the world. And I actually think while I enjoyed it and was in my comfort zone, I've needed to change my perspective that there is a need to provide a broader education. You can call it giving back. I will say the networking part might be how I personally benefit from this. It is great to meet new people, including some very senior folks, as well
Yeah.
as folks from a variety of different backgrounds. I'm fortunate to meet someone like yourself as an example. But as you mentioned, I don't charge for the Substack. I have no intention to do so. And I want people to be able to try and understand energy without the vitriol, without the ideology, without the extremism that comes from the perspectives are either I only believe in climate change and I only want to care about counting CO2 molecules and nothing else matters. It's the apocalypse is coming. Let's deal with only that. That's one end of the spectrum, or the other end of the spectrum, which is, hey, the climate's always changing. Stop. CO2 is good. Some people even say, and we clearly
Right.
need CO2 for some amount of warmth, on this earth. But maybe we are emitting a bit too much, and I think there is a need to, over time, figure out ways to capture methane, as an example, to try and decarbonize through more nuclear power to displace presumably coal production and these types of things. And so I think that need to both educate, to appeal to a broader audience, to be willing to be out there in my name, not behind an anonymous account or what have you, is probably what I've changed my mind most on.
Hmm.
When someone like myself says, hey, I hate the extremism, as an American, it's either the crazy Republican or the super progressive Democrat, and I don't like either one. Well, then those of us that are not in either extreme, not only do we need to vote, but we need to vocalize our views. And I don't like the term moderate because there's some things I'm deeply passionate about.
Hmm.
But in a traditional political sense, some are right of center. And I think some people, especially maybe people from Texas, might consider some of my views somewhat left of center, as an example. But whatever it is, I think most people fall within that spectrum, and I think there's a need for more people who share that I'm not an extremist, left or right, to be out there providing content and sharing their thoughts.
Right. No, and I think you're starting to see a lot more of it. And there's some that I applaud, and then others still kind of go at it at a bit of a us against the world mentality. But overall, I think there's more and more good content being put out there to, again, to help educate. I want to kind of switch and focus a little bit more on stuff that I'm sure I mean, while this is something on the day to day that you're familiar with, but more on, we talked about Canadian energy. And so again, being that, from Canada, and folks can certainly go back and listen to that space, but can you give sort of a broad sort of a scope as to, where Canadian energy is currently, and the role it could possibly play, and maybe some of the hurdles that we're experiencing, whether it's politically, from the investment community, and just kind of your take on how things are going to move, as we continue through this cycle.
If we are going to have a healthier energy transition, or whether it's a transition or not, a healthier energy environment, if we're going to have fundamentally sound economic growth, if we're going to have affordable energy, if we're going to have clean energy, environmentally friendly energy, I actually think there's no more important country at this moment than Canada. Clearly, you're in Texas right now with your job. The shales are pretty well understood. The Permian Basin is critically important. I think that's known, and no doubt the Permian Basin and some other U.S. plays will remain important. But people accept it. They know it. I think we're fortunate the Permian Basin is in Texas, so the oil and gas will be able to ultimately get produced and get out. That is not the case with Canada. So I hear a lot of really, I'm going to say, wrong narratives that get attached to Canada. People will say it's the dirtiest, highest cost barrel or MCF in the world. And I don't think that is even remotely accurate. And so let's go with the dirty moniker it gets. It's usually based on some 1970s era picture of an oil sands mine.
Yeah.
No doubt that mine wasn't the cleanest place on earth. And no doubt that is not the way to develop an oil sands field today. But to fast forward to right now, usually people perceive it as having the highest CO2 content. And not to bore everyone with the nitty gritty details, it's only true on scope 1 emissions that
Right.
Canada's oil sands are higher CO2. Once you combust it, which is 95% of your emissions, it's a negligible difference between, lower carbon, quote unquote, barrels, say in the Permian or Saudi Arabia or what have you. And I'm very impressed that the Canadian oils have come together, the big 6 or 7, to come up with this CCUS hub, which will address that scope 1 delta. Now they have to follow through with the plans. They have to be transparent on it, all those kind of things. But I think it's going to be untrue that it is the, quote, dirtiest barrel in the world looking at CO2 when you look forward. And even before that hub, because most of the CO2 comes from combustion, it's an irrelevant difference, especially when you consider Canada is presumably a friendly, stable country. They are significant allies. People in Canada happen to be super nice. And I sometimes say this in a joking way. Think about an issue like LGBTQ plus rights. Is that better respected in Canada or better respected in various Middle Eastern countries or Russia? As an example of an ESG metric that my personal view is an important thing to think about. And I would like my oil to come from an ESG friendly country. And I'm going to put Canada as at the top, or at least near the top of the list of best places to get your oil and gas. I think one of the big problems with this energy discussion is people want to label an entire technology or an entire basin as, quote, high cost or low cost. So you'll often hear that like solar and wind are currently the lowest forms of power generation. There's no chance that's true when they don't work a good chunk of the time. They may be very low cost when the sun is beating down on you or the wind is blowing, but then they're infinitely high cost when there isn't sun or wind. And so when you look at the totality of needing to have 24/7, 365, and on a leap year, 366 energy.
Yeah.
There's no way, there's no chance, zero chance solar and wind are, quote, the low cost. And when you look at oil, even in the Permian Basin, there are high cost, low cost, and mid cost regions, depending on exactly what part of the basin you're in, what zones you're in, and so forth. And that is going to be true of the oil sands. And then the final point is simply when you produce oil from the oil sands, there's 3 to 5 years of upfront capex, as you know, and then there's 25 years of essentially low maintenance capex, stable production. And there is significant value in the longevity of that production, which is not true of shale and other plays where you have to constantly drill. So it might be notionally lower cost, but you don't require as much upfront capex necessarily. But I'm not so sure when you look at the life cycle of these projects that it's actually higher cost. So if you look, for example, at the profitability, returns on capital employed is my preferred metric. You can look at different metrics of Suncor, Canadian Natural, and Cenovus, and compare them with any US or international major oil. They're highly competitive, and they are entirely or overwhelmingly oil sands companies. So it can't be true if their profitability is comparable that somehow Canada's oil sands are the highest cost barrel and these other plays are low cost. I find there's a lot of fundamental mistruths, falsehoods, rhetoric spewed towards these Canadian companies. And again, as you mentioned, I'm an American. I used to cover the Canadian oils. To my knowledge, I don't have direct Canadian oil investments. It's probably in some of the index funds or something. This is really purely my view as an analyst, having studied the sector for 30 years, is the basis for these comments.
That makes sense. Do you have any notion as to what the investment, and you kind of touched on it, but do you sense that the investment community could look at, the Canadian oil field as part of a good sort of, a way to sort of divest away from unconventionals here in the US, or is it still is there hesitancy because of the uncertainty politically what could happen? Do you see money funneling into Canada anytime soon, or is that still kind of up in arms, or are you just not sure?
I don't know about anytime soon. I think absolutely money will come back to the Canadian oil and gas sector because we're going to critically need it. And it's not just oil sands,
Right.
it's also the LNG potential that Europe and the rest of the world is going to need. I think aside from just normal cyclical considerations, investors will always wonder, hey, oil prices have come up a lot. What if they pull back? There's all those sort of normal considerations that cause capital to kind of come more quickly or more slowly. And we might be facing that at this moment with a little bit of the pullback we're having. But the biggest sort of fundamental bottleneck is the political uncertainty. And it frankly starts with the Canadian federal government, with all due respect, and extends to the US federal government. Both governments on both sides of the border I don't get the hostility towards such a critically important energy resource that is clearly more secure, more reliable, comparable cost, if not better cost. It's going to be comparable CO2, if not ultimately perhaps slightly better. You can control the methane if you desire, where you don't have that control in other countries. For all these reasons, our workers, our health, safety, and environmental standards, why there is such hostility from, frankly, environmentalists and politicians towards Canadian energy. I do not get it in the least. Let's just say you're an environmentalist. Say, you know what? I'm a diehard environmentalist. I definitely want to move on from oil and gas. I have no problem for the people who believe that view. Why would you start with Canada? Go to Siberia, go to Iranian export, go protest those forms of supply first. Make sure those sources of production are, quote, left in the ground without starting with Canada. How is it justice to a poor person in rural India or rural Africa to not have access to Canadian energy? Where is the social justice in that? Why should they be dependent on Russia, Iran, and some of these other countries that we don't want to be dependent on? Why should we leave it to the world's poor to be dependent on these unstable regimes? Again, an American's perspective from the rest of the world. I don't think there is a better barrel or a better MCF you could provide to the world than one from Canada.
Yeah, no, I remember back even in 2004 working there, and we were doing things back then with regards to certain whether it was additives or just, we were on the front line of the ESG movement well before it even became a thing, I feel like. And so, yeah, I would argue for sure it is probably one of the cleanest barrels to produce globally. And so moving sort of south of the border here into to the US, and do you see, so right now I think we're at, around 12 million a day, on the production side. There's anticipation we could get to 13 by the end of the year. We're draining our SPR. So I guess there's a few things to unpack there, but do you think the US is in a position, A, from an investment perspective, and B, just from an overall, ability to get to a point where we're exporting a considerable amount, and we're, ramping up, we're filling our SPR? Like, where do you kind of see that as we continue 2023, 2024?
So one of the substacks I wrote was called "We Need More Good Barrels and Fewer Bad Barrels," and it was, so right now, if you look at US plus Canada, our oil, and this includes liquids, supply and demand are broadly balanced. In my opinion, by 2030, between the US and Canada, we could be exporting together a net 10 million barrels a day. And that comes from a cumulative 5 million barrels a day of growth from the US, mostly shale, maybe a little bit of Alaska and some other areas, 3 million barrels a day from Canada. The Canada piece is entirely doable, but we're going to need to make some pretty quick progress on getting more preferred export capacity, meaning pipelines. Clearly, Canada can export via rail. We'd rather export via pipelines, which is environmentally better way to export and lower cost. And then I also build in 2 million barrels a day of net efficiency gains on the demand side. That's probably the squishiest number of the three to get to 10. But
Sure.
I'm an optimist that shale, from the Permian in particular, can continue to grow for, let's just call it, this decade. I don't know if we can count on it for 20 or 30 years of growth, but certainly for the remainder of this decade. And again, most of that's going to come into the Permian. Now, there are folks out there who are more pessimistic on the maturity of the shale plays, including the Permian. I'm going to have to say that I think that view is going to have to be guilty until proven innocent. I don't think there's evidence that companies are missing on production forecasts or guidance or cost to production or any number of metrics. There's clearly a lot of data one can look at these days. I used to be on the board of what is now Enverus, who was RS Energy Group at the time. I think they do a lot of great work on the inventory of locations and the cost of those locations. And of course, as oil is no longer 50, and as it's maybe 75 or 100 or some different higher number, some of what would have been tier 2 and tier 3 acreage will start coming into the money. And frankly, all the shale plays, but especially the Permian. So I am an optimist on Permian production growth. And within the context of these companies generally being, at least so far, more capital discipline than they've been in the past. I think that the piece that the demand piece, we can debate of whether miles per gallon, these things kick in or not, but the Canadian piece is the one that needs the most help. It is going to need the help of authorized and approved pipeline export capacity, by the way, including out of Canada, right? So it isn't just the American government holding this stuff up. As best as I can tell, Canada does have two coasts, one on the left, the west coast, and one on the right, the east coast. And perhaps Canadian provinces can figure out a way to get their pipeline exported without going through the US. But again, I'm not a Canadian geopolitical expert, so perhaps for some reason that's not possible. So
Yeah, no, and neither me. What's your argument or sort of response to when people say, like, I think there were several articles, I think maybe McKinsey, maybe a few other ones came out with saying peak demand for, for oil is going to be within the next, less than 10 years. I think it was like 5 or even 3 to 5 or something. And I mean, to me, it just seems unrealistic. But what's your take on peak demand globally?
Regarding oil specifically, I am much more an optimist on human flourishing, economic growth, the desire to eliminate and reduce energy poverty around the world. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to have the population growth that seems likely to have, which is an additional 2 billion people, maybe that number will prove high, we'll see. If you're going to have people go from 1 to 3 billion people who use less energy than the typical American's refrigerator, if you're going to give them the chance of if not a middle-class life, at least a better life than they have today. And then if we're going to maintain the lifestyles that we've already taken for granted here in the Western world, and if other parts of Asia, China, India, et cetera, are going to continue to make progress, then we will be using more crude oil, whether that's through 2040, 2050. I think we can debate the exact years. There should be a push towards significantly improved fuel economy. I just came back from visiting the United Kingdom, where my intermediate sized SUV averaged 59 miles per gallon. Kudos to Europe for at least getting one thing right about energy policy. They do have fuel efficient small or mid-sized SUVs, as the case may be. I think in the US, the number would have been 20, right? So there is an ability to actually moderate. So what you're trying to do is have economic growth with increasingly less oil demand growth. And already GDP grows at about double the rate of oil demand. So there is an inherent efficiency that occurs year in, year out. How do you get it to where you can have GDP growth with zero oil demand growth? That is a trick we have not cracked yet. And I think it's going to be a challenge. So right now, what we have are virtue signaling policies, things like let's ban ICE engines. I would argue, why not have a gas guzzler tax as an example for every car below? If Europeans can drive 50 mile per gallon cars, then certainly we can as well here in the United States. And I mean, the US is what matters for demand. So the US can as well. Figure that out. Don't make every person have to buy a luxury EV. It's absolutely absurd. It is bad for the middle and working class. It's not practical. I personally drive an electric vehicle. I love my Tesla. I love the enhanced driver system. I think they got the best system out there. I like the one pedal driving. I like the smooth acceleration. I am also a retired Goldman Sachs partner. I'm really lucky that I'm in a position to be able to easily afford an electric vehicle and have the charging at home. That is not the case for most Americans, for many Canadians, and clearly for the billions of people in the rest of the world. So the idea that somehow it's a climate solution, that is a joke, is a complete joke. Where there is opportunity is to figure out ways to, perhaps it's not banning SUVs, but it's banning vehicles that get less than 40 miles per gallon or 50 miles per gallon. It has probably been the biggest disappointment over the last 20 years is we have offset, I'd say 95% of the promised fuel economy gains by driving bigger, heavier cars. And that's a US number, but that's a big, big miss in terms of trying to disentangle or disengage oil demand growth from GDP growth, which is the trick. That is what we're trying to do. And we're not on track to do it. Hence, I am more positive on the outlook for oil demand going out to at least 2040, maybe 2050 in terms of growing.
Yeah, no, I mean, you bring up a good point, and I haven't looked at the numbers. I think I saw a report maybe from 2020, but sort of the percent of folks here in the US that drive certain categories of vehicles. And to like, because someone right now here in, say, Katy, Texas, who drives a Ford Expedition, and that if they were to say, oh, okay, well, now we're going to drive an electric vehicle, well, there's just nothing equivalent. So people would have to like essentially completely change their behaviors around transportation. And so to be able to replace, because no one's going to want to give up their big fancy SUV for something that you can barely fit 2 car seats in. And so again, and maybe I'm being ignorant. I haven't looked at, you know, the market of what's offered and the price and all the rest of it, but it's just, you know, and for how many F-150s are out here, I know Ford is making some, you know, strides on their electric truck, but I guess it would be interesting to see the data of what majority of vehicles make up driving, you know, say X amount of miles per day, and just how much infrastructure would be required. Does that meet the goal and the timeline and the amount that it's going to take? I don't know. Again, I haven't seen the numbers, but these are things that like make me scratch my head in terms of these, you know, sort of these blanket, after this year we're going to change. Because in my mind, it makes sense. Like, why not push for hybrids? I mean, hybrids make a lot of sense to me, to at least transition, right? That's the big term, is this, we're going to transition. We're not going to go from X to Y in like a matter of a year. And so it's just, it's interesting conversation. And I don't have, I've got some folks in my network that I could ask that maybe have a good answer. I don't know, but these are some of the things that at least I am curious about.
You know, you bring up a good perspective, Justin, which is there's these sort of blanket objectives that people want to achieve. By some year, we want to be here. And they're too big government, or they're too top down in their nature. So if there are
Right.
behaviors we want to change, so let's just say we do want to incentivize some element of fuel economy, but not make people be forced through mandate to give up their Ford F-150 as an example. How do you motivate the behavioral change? Is it a gas guzzler tax? The word tax doesn't work through a large portion of American politics, but how do you motivate? Maybe it's a mixture of hybrids. Maybe the people on the coast, which is really the East Coast and the West Coast, maybe for them, there are ways to motivate a switch to electric vehicles where they're not driving 400 miles in a day, and it is kind of nice to charge at home. Or maybe it's suburban America that needs to do more of that, where they own a house, but I think it's much tougher to certainly force this stuff on the middle of the country as an example. But it is incremental progress that is the only chance we have.
Yeah.
It is not through some declaration so if you take something, a totally different subject like streaming, was there a mandate that we're going to do away with DVDs and retail videos and force streaming and mandate that these companies have to be 100% streaming by some year? Or did consumer preference and technology and choice, should we not thank God that Blockbuster Video did not buy Netflix all those years ago?
That's a great
as
story.
Reed
Yeah.
Hastings suggested, was an opportunity that they
Yeah.
decided. And would we have the streaming today if Netflix wasn't an independent company, or if it was somehow mandated by the government? Now, maybe that's a ridiculous example because that's pure consumer choice and technology. And so this is in part an environmental consideration. But the
Sure.
point is, how do you create the motivations to start moving the needle? But that's the only chance you have, is to start moving the needle. And the
Mhm.
more it comes down to these blanket, we need to change 100% of our energy mix by some year, it becomes just a political rallying cry. It's not a real strategy. And so the
Yeah.
left will say we need to get 100% clean by 2035 or the world will end. The right will say, no, you're dumb. The world's not going to end. It's just sunspots or the earth's wobbling or something silly like that. Right? And we
Yeah.
would like to have decarbonized energy. We would like to have more choice in our energy. I think I live in a place on the East Coast where we regularly have blackouts. I'd love to have some elements of solar and storage so that I can
Right.
withstand when my stupid big utility, which is no one's friend, decides they don't feel like coming to my block till 3 weeks into the downturn or the outage, right? And so who wants to be beholden to big utilities? Nobody does, right? So this idea
Right.
of distributed energy, which is probably going to be more renewable in nature, maybe there are places where heat pumps work, right? So how do you create incentives so that building, construction people, and contractors are motivated to provide these as choices? I've already mentioned the example of trying to motivate people who to buy, whether it's hybrids or more fuel efficient. There's so many different things and so many different incentives you can put out there. When it boils down to we need to do 100% of this by some year, that is going to fail. But that doesn't mean there's no room for policy or for choices. And how do you motivate technology? How do you motivate? I drive a Tesla not because I care about my carbon emissions per se, but because it's a more enjoyable car to drive for me. I like the one pedal driving. I like the driver assist technology. I like
Yeah.
that it's not 8,000 buttons. It's basically an iPad. And when I get into a rental car, I have no idea which of those 42 different buttons you're trying to push to get the windshield wipers to go, as an example, right? So how do you keep doing that?
Right.
I'd love to have a geothermal heat pump system here, again, for the same power outage. I think
Yeah.
that's very cool. So what are the companies that are going to create consumer businesses around that? And so how do you motivate technology? What incentives to get the kind of environmental behavioral changes we need? I do think it's unacceptable to spew methane into the atmosphere. There's no reason for it. So what are the penalties that should be put in place if you still choose to do that? There are lots of things we can be doing, but I think we need to get away from the blanket statement. We need to be, quote, net zero by some year. You
Right.
just put people into camps. It's too top down. It's too big government. I do not believe that's how we're going to solve these issues.
Right. And if you look just historically, like the private markets and innovation and entrepreneurship is likely going to find a way to do it better, hopefully cheaper, more efficient. Just in general, I'm not even speaking about like energy production, but just in general, I mean, what we're capable of, if and kind of even going back to energy poverty, I think the North Star arguably is to like make sure that everyone in the entire planet has access to energy and hopefully clean water as well. And if you could tap into that talent pool to then figure out solutions to the problems that we either think we have or we've like said yes 100% we have, then I think at that point then you could get the entire planet working towards similar goals. But to, keep it kind of more here in the US it is challenging, and especially here people do not like to be told what to do. And so if you can make slow incremental changes over time versus saying at this point this is going to be the here's the solution, and at this point here's what you're going to have to do. Again, like you said, I think it ends up creating more frustration, more inhibition to be willing to change, and it's certainly not conducive to growth and prosperity and working together. But I don't know, for a long time it doesn't seem like the U.S. has worked together very well into in general. But again, from the outside looking in, now on the inside, but no, I mean lots of really good points. The last sort of question and discussion I was wanting to have is with regards to if you look back and let's talk unconventionals and the shale revolution, for so long it was volume over value. Well, we saw how that turned out, obviously. Over the last few years, arguably, capital discipline and free cash flow has been some big buzzwords, but it's been proven, and you could see this in the last few quarters, like folks are really, and sometimes almost forced, because I don't even know if we could ramp up, activity even if we tried. However, there's a lot more capital discipline now than before. I'm speaking in generalities. Do you see a point where that sentiment's going to change? Do you see this sort of discipline being maintained, which I think would be favorable? But I mean, do you think people are getting itchy, like kind of getting that itch to like, let's go? Or do you think people are going to remain sort of this discipline mentality? Any thoughts around that?
It's actually probably the topic I spend the most time on. As you know, as we started with, I'm a Wall Street analyst by background, and caring about the profitability trends has kind of been the core focus of mine. Again, I'll use return on capital as my metric, but I spend the most time writing, thinking, talking about this specific subject. And so, listen, if you look back over 100 years of this industry, for industry broadly speaking, it's a cost of capital business, which makes sense. It's a commodity business.
Yeah.
It needs growing capital to continue to be able to invest. And so you can't have too low of a return or capital goes away, as we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years. But if you have too high of a return, ultimately too much capital comes in. And that's the boom bust cycle. And so for the sector at large, to use round numbers, it's been a 10% return on capital business, which has been enough to ensure enough supply growth to match demand growth. But within that, your best-in-class companies, the top quartile, have consistently done 12 to 15% or better returns on capital. Now, sometimes who is in this top quartile can change a little bit. I will say that prior to 2010, ExxonMobil and all their predecessor companies and Royal Dutch Shell were the two best-in-class companies that since the industry's founding in the late 1800s, but on data since the early 1900s, for 100 years, they had competitive returns on capital that were competitive with the broader stock market through all the booms and busts. And so it is possible that select companies, that top quartile, which I think is the aspiration, can and will generate double-digit or mid-teens returns on capital. Now, today we don't have as many of these super majors. It used to be kind of the big integrateds that were the ones with the longer-lived assets that were more disciplined and generated those sustainably better returns, better than that industry average that I just referenced. I think today the question is, which you're asking, will there be some subset of these E&Ps? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And frankly, including some of the refiners, as we've seen, some of them, the Phillips 66s and Marathon Petroleums and Valeros of the world, some of them have very interesting business models and have also demonstrated the ability to generate very good sustained returns on capital. So I think for that top quartile, I feel really good about it. For industry at large, these return on capital cycles tend to be 10 to 15 years up, 10 to 15 years down. We're coming off a 15-year downturn. So it's going to feel good for everybody, not just these best companies for some period of time, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, we'll see. But I probably still would be skeptical that the discipline will last over the long run. Now, in part, that could be because the good inventory runs out. And so then companies would feel pressured to do acquisitions or fill-ins or so forth. But that's the basic nature of industry. And so whether it's as an investor, an analyst, or a board member, I am trying to figure out whichever companies I'm involved with, how can I ensure that they're in a position to maintain competitive, superior returns on capital, not just in the good times, but also in the bad times. But if I'm being realistic, I would say, the old line, and I will apologize for using it here, a real man drills wells, and it has been historically a male-dominated sector, so hopefully the phrasing's okay.
Sure.
Today, maybe a real man and woman drills wells. I would probably worry, as a lifelong Wall Street person, that sort of traditional way of thinking will rise up again. Now, things like the virtue signaling part of ESG, things like the overt hostility from especially federal governments and some of the activist community out there. These are the kind of things that could slow. It has so far slowed the CapEx impulse to these higher prices we're seeing. So I think the duration of the upcycle does seem like it's going to, there's going to be more discipline for a longer period of time. It's being somewhat forced upon these companies. And frankly, there is a newfound concern. I gave you my opinion that oil demand will grow through 2040 or possibly 2050. But there are plenty of reasonable people who are not diehard climate activists who are worried that demand will flatten out, maybe not peak in the next 1 year, but could flatten out going forward. And that's going to keep capital on the sidelines, which is, hey, there's a non-zero probability that some element of energy transition works. And let's be honest, Tesla's now got a dominant share of the luxury vehicle market. That has never been true historically. So it's easy to poke fun of, I'm against 100% EV mandate, but I actually think EVs are better cars. And I think the Ford F-150, which I believe is called the Ford Ford Electric or F-150 Electric.
I think it's the Lightning, Ford
Lightning. The
Lightning.
Thank you. The Ford F-150 Lightning. Thank you very much. By all accounts, I think Texans are going to like that car. I think real oil and gas people, not East Coast elites like myself, but real oil and gas people, I suspect, are going to like that car. It is awesome to drive electric vehicles. And so who knows whether the cost will come down so that a broader segment of the world's population can afford them or not. But there are inroads being made. So all of those things does keep CapEx and investors somewhat on the sideline. But it's one of these things where the more people are hesitant, the more they are concerned, the more bottlenecks that are thrown up, the more hostility that comes from the federal government, the better it is for the sector. Actually, it may not feel good to be yelled at, to be told you're not doing good and all these kind of things, but from a profitability standpoint, there's actually an inverse correlation between being liked, if you will, and how your performance is. So the more disliked you are, the better the profitability is likely to be.
Right. No, I mean, I feel like we just almost scratched the surface.
It's a bizarro world sector. You may be too young for Seinfeld. I'm not so sure, but the bizarro world sector means, okay, that's good. What's good is bad and what's bad is good. It is an absolute bizarro world sector. For sure, what's good is bad and what's bad is good. So,
well, I think one thing for certain, and I don't think anyone could argue, is that the demand for energy is going to continue to increase. And so, for the folks out there, really appreciate you listening. Hopefully, you learned something, and even more importantly, go follow and subscribe to Arjun's Substack. I'll put all the links in the show notes. Arjun, one last question to close out, something to kind of decompress a little bit more, something on the fun side of it, but. If what does Arjun's ideal Friday night look like? If you could do anything in the world, had all the resources in the world, you could fly anywheres, what would your ideal Friday night look like, and who would you spend it with?
Well, there's no question I would spend it with my wife and my 3 children, even as my children are getting older and may not be as excited to be spending it with their mom and dad. I would say we would have just come off the old course in St. Andrews, and we'd be going to the pub to get a pint of Guinness or a Scotch whiskey with my children and wife there for sure. That would be the dream scenario. It is a scenario that I mostly lived out just last week.
Nice.
My son goes to school in St. Andrews, which is a golfing family we're pretty excited about. They got a child at USC and a third one still with us. But that is the dream scenario for me.
Beautiful. Well, hopefully you have many a Friday night like that in the future. And thanks again for joining me. So aside from that, is there any other resources that people, so you're on Twitter, LinkedIn, you got your Substack, anything else to mention?
I mean, Substack's the main avenue. So I do some YouTube videos, but I put them all through the Substack. I am on Twitter as well, but those are the main avenues to connect with. And, Justin, while I have this opportunity in our closing statement, I appreciate that you work in the oil and gas industry. So thank you for what you're doing to help allow this Zoom to occur you can see I have the lights on in my house here and we got the fan on. And I know that unlike maybe a lot of my audience, you have a lot of audience that works in the industry. So I am truly appreciative of all the hard work that the folks do in the oil and gas industry. And I am sorry that it is a boom bust cycle. I think that can be very hard. I don't have a solution on how to change that. I will say that even for my own children, I think it's unlikely, just given the tracks they're on, that they're probably going to work in the oil and gas industry. But I'd rather they work for any U.S. or Canadian oil company than, say, in an Amazon warehouse. That is an inherently less safe place. I'd rather they work in the Permian Basin than on a Hollywood movie set. Again, not a close call if you look at safety statistics, to work in the Permian Basin versus many Hollywood movie sets. And so I am appreciative of all the hard work for all your listeners. And again, thank you for having me on, Justin.
Well, definitely humbled by the kind words, Arjun. I appreciate that. And before we close, I do want to remind the listeners that I'm currently opening up sponsorship opportunities for the podcast. So if any energy-focused companies are looking to increase their brand marketing initiatives, their visibility and awareness around your company's initiatives through the podcast, please reach out to me. I'd love to work with you. And with that said, everyone, always remember, everyone deserves access to energy, and we is greater than me. Thanks, everybody.